The streets of New York City were always alive with movement, flashing lights, honking taxis, and the endless rhythm of people chasing their dreams. But for Emma Carter, life moved at a slower pace. She wasn't part of the city's fast-moving elite. She didn't own a car or have an office in a high-rise building. Her world was a small wooden cart filled with freshly baked bread, and her daily goal was simple: sell enough loaves to survive. Every morning, before the sun even rose, Emma woke up in the tiny attic she rented in an old crumbling building. The room was small and cold, barely big enough for a mattress and a makeshift kitchen, but it was home. She would knead the dough with her tired hands, humming softly to herself before carefully baking each loaf in the old oven she had fought so hard to buy. By the time the city started waking up, she would be pushing her cart through the streets searching for customers. She had been doing this for 3 years, 3 long years since her mother had passed away, leaving her alone in the world. She had no one, no family, no friends who could help her. Just the bread and the hope that one day something would change. That evening the air was crisp, and a light snowfall dusted the streets. Emma stood at her usual spot, the corner of Fifth Avenue, where busy professionals and tourists passed by without giving her a second glance. She clutched the edges of her worn-out coat, trying to fight off the cold, while hoping someone would stop to buy her last few loaves. And then fate intervened. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb, the kind of car that belonged to the rich and powerful, the kind of people who never noticed someone like her. Emma glanced at it for only a second before looking away. It wasn't unusual for luxury cars to pass her by, but then the back door opened. A man stepped out, and for a moment the world around Emma seemed to freeze. He was breathtaking, tall, with broad shoulders, a sharp jawline, and piercing brown eyes that held something unreadable. His perfectly tailored suit clung to his frame, in a way that screamed wealth and power. But what truly made Emma's breath catch in her throat was the way he was looking at her. Like she was someone worth noticing, he took a step closer. "How much for everything?" Emma blinked, thinking she had misheard him. I'm sorry." "The bread," he repeated, his voice smooth and confident. "How much for all of it?" Emma stared at him, unsure whether he was serious. No one had ever offered to buy everything before. Her mind scrambled for an answer. $60? He pulled out his wallet and handed her a crisp $100 bill. "Keep the change." Emma's fingers trembled as she took the money. "Thank you, sir, but why?" He smirked slightly. "Because I can, and because your bread smells incredible." He glanced at her cart again before meeting her eyes. "Do you bake it yourself?" She nodded slowly. "Every morning." "Impressive," he murmured. Then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he turned back toward his limousine. But before getting in, he looked at her once more. "I might be back tomorrow." And then he was gone. Emma stood there for a long moment, clutching the bill in her frozen hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who was he? Why had he bought all her bread? And most importantly, would he really come back? That night, as she lay on her mattress, staring at the ceiling of her tiny attic, she couldn't stop thinking about him, the mysterious billionaire who had stepped into her world like something out of a dream. She didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of a story she never could have imagined. The next morning, Emma woke up before dawn, just as she always did. But today, something felt different. The encounter with the mysterious billionaire lingered in her mind like a dream she wasn't ready to wake up from. Had she imagined it? No. The crisp $100 bill on her nightstand was proof that it had been real. Shaking off her thoughts, she got to work. The dough had to be kneaded, the bread had to rise, and the oven had to be hot before the city woke up. She worked with precision, her hands moving quickly as she shaped each loaf. Today, she made more than usual, just in case. By the time she wheeled her cart to her usual spot on Fifth Avenue, the sun had barely begun to rise. The cold air bit at her fingers, but Emma barely noticed. Her heart pounded every time she heard a car slow down near the curb. She kept glancing down the street, searching for the black limousine. Hours passed. The morning rush came and went. Businessmen in expensive suits walked by, too busy on their phones to notice her. Mothers with strollers hurried past, some stopping to buy a loaf, or two. But he didn't come. By noon, Emma forced herself to focus. Of course, he wasn't coming back. Why would a billionaire care about a simple bread seller? He had probably bought all her bread on a whim, something the rich did just because they could. She was foolish for hoping otherwise. Just as she was about to push the thought from her mind completely, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of a luxury car slowing to a stop. Emma's breath caught as the black limousine pulled up to the curb, the same one from the night before. And then the door opened. There he was, still impossibly handsome, still dressed, in an expensive suit that looked like it had been tailored just for him. His dark brown eyes locked onto hers, and this time there was something almost amused in his gaze. "Good morning," he said smoothly. Emma swallowed hard. "Morning, sir." His lips twitched. "Sir, I think we can do better than that. My name is Adrian. Adrian Blackwood." The name sent a jolt through her. She had heard it before. Who hadn't? Adrian Blackwood was one of the richest men in New York, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, a company that owned everything from luxury, hotels to tech startups. He was constantly in the news, always surrounded by models or celebrities. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her bread cart. Emma quickly found her voice. "I'm Emma," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Emma," he repeated as if testing the way it sounded. Then he gestured toward her cart. "How much for everything today?" She blinked. "You want all of it? Again?" Adrian chuckled. "Yes. Is that a problem?" Emma hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's just... Why?" His eyes sparkled with something unreadable. "Let's just say I like good bread." She knew there was more to it than that, but she didn't push. Instead, she gave him the price. Once again, he handed her $100 bill and refused the change. But this time he didn't leave right away. Instead, he leaned against the cart, studying her. "You bake all this yourself every morning?" She nodded. "Yes, it's the only way I can afford rent." Adrian was silent for a moment, then said, "You ever thought about opening a bakery?" Emma laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Of course, but dreams like that take money, and I can barely afford to keep this cart running." Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. Then, to her complete shock, he said, "What if I invested in you?" Emma's heart nearly stopped. "What?" he shrugged. "I like your bread, and I like seeing people with ambition. If you're willing to work for it, I can help make your dream a reality." Emma opened her mouth, then closed it. This had to be some kind of joke. Billionaires didn't just offer investments to street vendors. "But why would you do that?" she asked carefully. Adrian's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Because sometimes a good investment isn't just about money." Before she could respond, he took one of the loaves, gave her a small nod, and stepped back into his limousine. The door shut, and just like that, he was gone. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Was he serious? Was this real? She had no idea. But one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. Emma barely slept that night. She lay in her tiny attic room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of her conversation with Adrian Blackwood. His words echoed in her mind. "What if I invested in you?" It was absurd, unbelievable. People like him didn't just throw opportunities at people like her. He was a billionaire. He could buy anything he wanted. Why would he care about a bread seller struggling to survive? And yet, there had been something in his eyes, something that made her believe he wasn't joking. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the small window, Emma had made a decision. She would go to work as usual. She wouldn't get her hopes up. If Adrian Blackwood was serious, he would come back. If not, well, she would keep pushing her cart just like she always had. With a deep breath, she got up and started baking. By the time she reached her usual spot on 5th Avenue, the city was already alive with movement. People rushed past, too busy with their own lives to notice her. Emma forced herself to focus on selling, greeting customers with a smile, and trying not to glance down the street every time a car slowed down. But then, just before noon, the now familiar black limousine pulled up to the curb. Emma's breath hitched. The door opened and there he was. Adrian Blackwood, stepping out like he owned the world, which, in some ways, he probably did. His dark brown eyes locked onto hers, a small smirk playing on his lips as he approached her cart. "Good morning, Emma," he said smoothly. She swallowed hard. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." He raised an eyebrow. "I thought we agreed on Adrian." Emma cleared her throat. "Right, Adrian." His smirk deepened. "That's better." Then, without hesitation, he leaned against the cart, casually inspecting the fresh loaves. "So have you thought about my offer?" Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of the cart. I don't know if you were serious." Adrian tilted his head. "I don't make empty promises, Emma. If I say I want to invest in you, I mean it." She studied him carefully, searching for any hint of a joke, but there was none. "You don't even know me," she said finally. "True," he admitted. "But I know potential when I see it. And I know good business." He gestured toward her bread. "This? It's better than anything I've had in high-end bakeries. You have skill, Emma. You just don't have the resources to take it further. But I do." Emma's heart pounded. Was this really happening? "But what do you get out of it?" she asked cautiously. Adrian chuckled. "Ah, there it is. The question everyone asks when something seems too good to be true." He leaned closer, his gaze unreadable. "Let's just say, I enjoy seeing small things grow into something bigger. It's a habit of mine." She bit her lip, still unsure. Sensing her hesitation, Adrian pulled out a sleek business card and handed it to her. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said. "No pressure, just a conversation. If you're interested, we'll talk. If not, you can forget this ever happened." Emma hesitated before taking the card. She glanced at the elegant gold lettering, Blackwood Enterprises. CEO, Adrian Blackwood. She swallowed hard. This was real. Adrian studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. Then, with a small smirk, he stepped back into his limousine and disappeared into the city once again. Emma stood there gripping the card tightly, her mind racing. She had a choice to make, and for the first time in her life, she had a chance at something bigger than she had ever dreamed. Emma stood outside the towering glass skyscraper, gripping the business card in her trembling fingers. Blackwood Enterprises. She had barely slept the night before, her mind tangled in doubt and disbelief. What was she doing here? She was a bread seller, not a businesswoman. Walking into a billionaire's office felt like stepping into a world she didn't belong in, and yet, here she was. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the massive glass doors and stepped inside. The lobby was breathtaking. Polished marble floors, modern chandeliers, and staff dressed in sharp suits moving with purpose. Emma felt instantly out of place in her simple jeans and sweater, but she forced herself to move forward. The receptionist, a tall, elegant woman with red hair, barely glanced at her. "Do you have an appointment?" Yes, Adrian Blackwood asked me to come." At the mention of his name, the receptionist's eyes snapped up. She gave Emma a once-over, her expression unreadable, before nodding. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Take the private elevator to the top floor." Emma swallowed hard. Private elevator? She followed the directions and stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. As the doors slid shut, her heart pounded. What was she even going to say to him? Before she could overthink, the doors opened, revealing an office, straight out of a movie. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline, and sleek black furniture gave the room a modern, powerful look. And there, sitting behind a massive desk, was Adrian Blackwood. He looked up from his laptop as she stepped in, his brown eyes instantly locking onto hers. A slow smirk played on his lips. "You came." Emma cleared her throat, trying to steady her nerves. "I figured it was worth hearing you out." Adrian gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit." She did, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Now, let's get straight to the point. I want to invest in you, not just as a small-time vendor, but as a businesswoman. You have talent, Emma. Your bread is better than half the overpriced junk sold in luxury bakeries." With the right resources, you could have your own bakery, your own brand. Emma's breath hitched. Her own bakery, it sounded impossible. But I don't know anything about running a business, she admitted. Adrian shrugged. That's where I come in. I have the connections, the funds, and the experience. You have the skill and the passion. Together, we make it work. Emma's head spun. This was unreal. She bit her lip. Why me, though? You could invest in anyone. Adrian's gaze darkened slightly, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Because I see something in you, Emma. Something rare. The air between them felt charged, but Emma quickly shook the thought away. This was business, nothing more. She took a deep breath. And what do you want in return? Adrian leaned back, studying her. 50% of the business. I'll fund everything. Location, equipment, marketing. You'll be in charge of the baking and operations. We split the profits. Emma hesitated. 50% was a lot. But without him, she wouldn't have anything at all. After a long pause, she met his gaze. Okay. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his lips. Good choice. Just like that, Emma Carter's life changed forever. Emma walked out of Blackwood Enterprises with her heart racing. Did that really just happen? She had come in expecting to be laughed out of the building, but instead, she had walked out with a deal that could change her life forever. A bakery of her own, a real chance to build something beyond her little street cart. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the city suddenly felt different, bigger, brighter, full of possibilities, but at the same time doubt crept into her mind. Could she really do this? She had spent years baking to survive, not to run a full-fledged business. What if she failed? What if Adrian regretted investing in her? Her fingers tightened around the contract in her bag. There was no turning back now. That evening, she worked. At her cart as usual, selling her bread and saving every dollar she could. It might be her last time on this street corner. If everything went according to plan, she'd soon be baking in a real kitchen, in a real bakery, with customers walking through her doors. The thought both terrified and excited her. 2 days later, Adrian called. I have a location picked out, he said smoothly over the phone. Meet me there in an hour. Emma barely had time to change before rushing to the address he sent. When she arrived, she stopped in her tracks. The storefront was beautiful. Large glass windows, a prime spot, on a busy street with foot traffic. It was a place people would actually notice, not a small corner where she struggled to catch passing customers. Adrian was already there, standing outside with his hands in his pockets, watching her reaction with amusement. What do you think? Emma swallowed hard. It's perfect, he smirked. Good, then let's get to work. The next few weeks were a blur. Adrian moved fast. Contracts were signed, renovations started, and before Emma could even catch her breath, she was selecting ovens, counters, and display cases. Every decision felt overwhelming, but Adrian was there, guiding her through it with a confidence that both reassured and intimidated her. She saw a different side of him during those days, not just the billionaire businessman, but someone who knew how to make things happen. He had a sharp eye for details, a way of cutting through indecision and getting things done. But he was also demanding. You need to think bigger, he told her one day as they reviewed the menu. Bread alone won't cut it. You need pastries, cakes, things that make people come back. Emma frowned. I don't know how to make fancy pastries. Adrian didn't even blink. Then learn. That was the kind of man he was. No room for excuses, no room for failure. And despite the pressure, Emma found herself liking it. She had never been challenged like this before, never been pushed to dream beyond what she thought was possible. And though Adrian could be ruthless in business, she noticed the way he always made sure she had the final say. It was her bakery, after all. One evening, after a long day of preparation, Adrian walked her to the entrance of the nearly finished shop. The sign above the door gleamed in the city lights, Emma's Artisan Bakery. Seeing her name up there brought tears to her eyes. Adrian watched her quietly. Regretting it yet? She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. No, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. For the first time, his expression softened. Good. because this is just the beginning. As she looked up at her bakery, her dream, she realized he was right. This was only the start of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The grand opening of Emma's Artisan Bakery was set for Saturday, and the anticipation was unlike anything Emma had ever felt before. Every moment leading up to it had been filled with work, training staff, finalizing recipes, testing the ovens. The shop had transformed from an empty space into something warm and inviting. With wooden shelves lined with fresh loaves, glass displays showcasing golden pastries, and the comforting scent of cinnamon and butter filling the air. But as the day approached, anxiety crept in. What if no one showed up? What if people didn't like her bread anymore now that it wasn't coming from her little street cart? What if she failed? She barely had time to sleep, let alone process everything. But Adrian, he was as calm as ever. "You're overthinking," he told her the night before the opening. They were sitting in the bakery going over last-minute details. "People love your bread, that hasn't changed." Emma sighed. "It's just, this is everything to me. If it doesn't work, I lose everything." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You won't lose everything, Emma." She met his gaze. "How do you know that?" "Because you're not doing this alone." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I don't make bad investments and I don't let things fail." Emma didn't know why, but those words reassured her more than anything else. The next morning she arrived before sunrise, her heart pounding. The bakery was spotless, the shelves fully stocked, the warm scent of freshly baked goods already filling the air. By the time the doors opened, Emma was practically shaking. And then, people started coming. At first, it was a few curious passers-by, drawn in by the warm glow and the smell of fresh bread. Then more came, former customers from her cart, strangers who had seen the buzz online thanks to Adrian's marketing team, even businessmen and women who worked in nearby offices. Within the first hour, they had a line out the door. Emma barely had time to breathe as she moved between customers, taking orders, explaining the menu, making sure everything ran smoothly. And through it all, Adrian was there. Not behind the counter, of course, he was a billionaire after all, but watching from the corner, a satisfied smirk on his lips as he saw it all unfold. At one point, Emma caught his eye, her face flushed from the rush, flour dusting her apron. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "I told you so." By the end of the day, they had completely sold out. Emma stood in the middle of her bakery, exhausted but exhilarated. She had done it. She had gone from selling bread on the streets to owning a bakery that people actually wanted to come to. Adrian walked over, hands in his pockets. "Not bad for your first day." Emma let out a breathless laugh. "Not bad, we sold everything." He smirked. "Told you." She shook her head, still in disbelief. "I don't even know how to thank you for this." Adrian's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. "You don't need to." There was a moment, just a moment, where the air between them felt different, charged. Emma felt it. And by the way, Adrian's smirk faded into something softer. She knew he felt it too. But just as quickly as it came, he cleared his throat and stepped back. "This is just the beginning, Emma. Keep up with the success, and soon you won't just have one bakery." Emma blinked. "More bakeries." His lips curled into that familiar smirk. "Dream bigger." And for the first time in her life, Emma let herself believe she could. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's Artisan Bakery became one of the most talked-about spots in the city. Every morning, customers lined up before the doors even opened, eager to get their hands on her fresh bread and pastries. The overwhelming success was beyond anything Emma had imagined. But success came with its own set of challenges. Managing a bakery was different from selling bread on the street. The business side of things, handling employees, ordering supplies, dealing with finances, was exhausting. Some days Emma barely had time to sleep and she found herself overwhelmed by the weight of her own dream. Adrian noticed. One evening after closing, she sat at one of the tables rubbing her temples as she stared at endless invoices. "You look like you're about to collapse," Adrian's smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see him standing by the counter, watching her. He had stopped by almost every night after closing, always checking in, always making sure she was managing everything. Emma sighed. I'm just trying to figure out how to balance everything. Baking is easy. Running a business? Not so much. Adrian pulled out a chair and sat across from her. That's why you have me. She let out a dry laugh. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, he said. You're overloading yourself. You need a manager. Emma frowned. I don't know if I can afford... You can, he cut in. The bakery is already turning a profit. Hiring a manager will free you up to focus on what you do best, baking. She hesitated, but she knew he was right. She couldn't do everything on her own. I'll start looking for someone, she finally said. Adrian nodded approvingly, then leaned back in his chair, studying her. You know you never stop moving, even when you should. Emma raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? It means you need to take a break, he said simply. Come with me tomorrow night. Emma blinked. Go where? A dinner, a business event. She shook her head. Adrian, I don't belong at things like that, he smirked. That's exactly why you should come. Emma hesitated. A fancy business dinner? With him? I don't have anything to wear, she said, grasping for an excuse. Handled, he said. You'll have a dress delivered tomorrow. Her mouth fell open. You already planned this? His smirk deepened. I always plan ahead, Emma. She stared at him, feeling trapped. I still don't know. Adrian leaned in slightly, his voice lower now. Trust me. One night away from the bakery won't kill you. Emma swallowed hard. Why did it suddenly feel like this wasn't just a business invitation? Fine, she muttered. One night. Adrian's smirk softened into something almost pleased. Good choice. And just like that, Emma Carter found herself agreeing to an evening that could change everything. The next evening, Emma stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing herself. The dress Adrian had sent was stunning, a sleek midnight blue gown that hugged her figure in all the right places. It was unlike anything she had ever owned, let alone worn. Her usual ponytail had been replaced with soft waves that framed her face, and for the first time in years, she wore makeup. She looked elegant, sophisticated, like she belonged in Adrian Blackwood's world. Her stomach twisted at the thought. I don't belong in his world. But when she stepped outside and saw Adrian waiting by the car, something in his expression made her pause. His usual smirk was gone. Instead, his eyes ran over her slowly, taking in every detail. You clean up well, Carter, he said, voice lower than usual. Emma swallowed. Don't sound so surprised. Adrian chuckled, opening the car door for her. Let's go before I change my mind about sharing the spotlight tonight. The event was held in one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. The moment they walked in, Emma felt every eye turn toward them, or more specifically toward Adrian. Everyone wanted a piece of him, business executives, investors, socialites, and yet, despite the constant attention, he never left her side. At first, Emma felt out of place, but as the night went on, she realized something surprising. She wasn't just Adrian Blackwood's date. People actually wanted to talk to her. They had heard about her bakery. Some had even visited. A few even wanted to discuss potential partnerships. For the first time, Emma saw herself not just as a bread seller or a struggling entrepreneur, but as someone who had built something valuable. Adrian leaned in at one point, his breath warm against her ear. Told you this was worth it. She glanced up at him. You love being right, don't you? He smirked. It's one of my best qualities. The evening passed in a blur, of conversations, laughter, and stolen glances between them that Emma tried to ignore. But as the night wound down, something unexpected happened. A woman approached them, tall, elegant, with sharp eyes that reminded Emma of a predator. Adrian, the woman said smoothly, barely acknowledging Emma. It's been a while. Emma felt Adrian tense beside her. Madeline, he said, his voice cold. Emma didn't know who she was, but the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Madeline's gaze flickered to Emma, her lips curling in a knowing smirk. I see you found interesting company. Emma's stomach clenched. But before she could respond, Adrian stepped slightly in front of her. "Emma is none of your concern." His voice was sharp, warning. Madeline's smirk didn't falter. "Of course not. Just be careful, darling. Some people don't belong in our world." And with that she walked away. Emma let out a slow breath, her heart pounding. Who was that? Adrian's jaw tightened. No one important. But Emma wasn't stupid. Whoever she was, she had been important. The night suddenly felt heavier. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Let's get out of here." The drive back was silent. When they arrived at her apartment, Emma hesitated before stepping out. "Adrian." "What Madeline said—" "Forget her," he interrupted. "She doesn't know anything about you." Emma bit her lip. "But do you think I don't belong in your world?" For the first time that night, Adrian looked uncertain. His hand lifted slightly, as if he was about to reach for her, but then he stopped himself. "You belong exactly where you want to be, Emma," he said softly. The air between them crackled with something unspoken. For a moment, Emma thought he might kiss her. But then he stepped back, his walls going up again. "Good night, Carter." And just like that, he was gone. Emma stood in the doorway, her heart a mess of emotions. She had stolen the heart of a billionaire. But what happened next? That was something neither of them were ready to face, yet.